Kris Jennings is a friend of a friend who every time I talk with her, it's like, oh, we need to talk some more. Kris is also an author. She has written a book called Inspired by Fear, Becoming a Courageous Change Leader. And of course, in Courageous Wordsmith, you know that I want to talk about that. You're listening to Courageous Wordsmith. I'm Amy Hallberg, author, editor, and creative mentor. And these are conversations with real-life creatives on how we find and embody our voices. Because if you want to be a real-life creative, it helps to know what that looks like for you. Welcome to Courageous Wordsmith. Hey, Kris, thank you for being here.
Thanks, Amy. I can't wait to talk courage and words with you.
Well, can we talk about your words and why you felt it was important to write a book about courage?
Well, it's a bucket list thing for me. So, having grown up as a journalism student, I have wanted to write a book probably since I was, well, my first book, I think technically was fifth grade. I found something my mother had saved from many, many years ago. But writing an actual book and having it published and out in the world was truly a bucket list goal for me. So, I know I chose to write this book because it supports my business and it really also supports my personal story and the challenges that I've had in my life, just in terms of living into my fear and embracing and accepting fear as a part of my life. As somebody who has been diagnosed with chronic PTSD, I'm in one of those balancing acts in life where fear is just part of my life, and so learning how to accept it and how to notice moments when it limits me and times when I can choose to do something because it's more important than the fear, which is how I define courage. So,
I want to talk more about your book, but you just suggested a lot of story there. So I would like to back up into that story. So I want to hear about your business, but I guess I first want to hear about like the PTSD, like what have you overcome to get to the point? Because let me just say, when you write a book, I think people are like, oh, I want to write a book, and don't always understand that writing isn't the first part. The first part is living into what will have been written. So what is it that happened in your life that gave you something to write about?
yeah. And I think what's interesting about the book is that it is a combination of both that personal experience for me, my personal lived
Mm-hmm.
experience, and how I process fear, which is really, PTSD is just kind of a miswiring in my brain of how I handle fear. Not necessarily that I, have to have had significant trauma any different than anyone else has had experiences in their life that they might describe as capital T trauma. I literally just have a brain that interprets those experiences differently. And so for me, my diagnosis in 2020 in the midst of the pandemic, which, for many of us, I think we can relate to that experience of the fear in the world was amplified. And so it was that moment when I really started to say, this isn't just like standard anxiety. This isn't, normal, just like worry about the world. This is something different. And that, for me, getting that diagnosis changed everything because it changed how I got treatment and what modalities I use, the things that I do to support myself. This is something that I've lived with my entire adult life. So literally those moments when I figured out, well, okay, here are things that I can do differently as a result of having a brain that interprets the world in a way that requires me to be on alert 100% of the time, hypervigilant. I've had to unwind and unpack my neural pathways, and then also behaviorally kind of like, what do I do to support myself to retrain how I respond to environmental stimuli, environments and situations that may not be perceived as scary, but my brain and my body, interpret it as something to be threatened by. So it's been a lot of work in the last 5 years in particular.
Can you share with me an example of like, so, you named it during the pandemic, but as you said, it had been there before. It's just, I think in the pandemic, we finally had time to pay attention to those things we'd been brushing aside for a long time. So can you give an example of something that might have been really anxiety provoking that you remember prior to the
Yeah,
pandemic?
well, I mean, in a really simple thing, which is, our common friend on a walk, right? We're walking in the woods, and a squirrel startled me, right? A squirrel like rustled, right? And that's not something to be afraid of, right? But like I literally jumped. It was like, and so that happening in 2020 and compared to now, like the difference is that I have worked with my nervous system, so that kind of like startle response to a normal thing in the world, I don't have that kind of response anymore, right? And that is really comes through an understanding of like, yes, I did a lot of things with my brain, so I did EMDR, and that made a significant impact immediately.
Can you describe what EMDR? I do know
Yeah,
what it is, but can you describe it for
it,
people who've never
yeah,
never
it's
heard of
a
it?
therapy type that actually changes the pathways between your hemispheres in the brain, right brain, left brain. And so for me, I did it virtually, which meant because it was during the pandemic. And so I watched a blue dot on the screen while I talked, while I was guided through a memory.
And for people who can't see what you're doing, you're actually moving your hand from side to side because the point of it is that it's literally tap one side of your body, tap another side, or somehow getting your body responding to both sides in
Yeah,
alternation.
it's right left hemisphere, and yeah, and more recently, I actually did a whole neuromodulation biofeedback test to understand. Like, I literally saw a heat map of my brain, so I can see. I saw my amygdala, right, the fear center. I saw that as a place where there was not normal blood flow. Like we saw, I also do this thing where I kind of zone out. Daydreaming is what I've always thought it was,
Mhm,
but it's actually a
mhm,
freeze response in my brain. So
mm.
like I when I get overstimulated, I shut down and I go into that. And I saw that happening of like two circle spots in my brain, where the like where the basically where my just kind of shut my brain down, where there's no blood flow. So those are examples of like the brain stuff that I've done. And then I've also done a lot of work with my nervous system and just understanding like where is my capacity at and how do I expand that capacity, to do more, I guess I would say normal things or things that might be uncomfortable, could have been uncomfortable for me in the past, and be able to handle them, right? And so recognizing that difference between being uncomfortable and unsafe, right? And so for my brain, those two things were really always combined. If I always felt that if I felt something, unusual in my environment, that meant that I was unsafe, and I became hypervigilant.
Right, and when you say that, so you mentioned that you had a freeze response. So that's the sympathetic nervous system, right? It has these responses, fight, flight, freeze, fawn, flop. When you don't know what those are, then you're just like, "What am I doing?" But if you know that, you can look back and go, "Oh, when I did this thing there, that was a freeze response." And it's it's almost like there's two things happening. You have your gifts, the things that you're good at, and then there's this interruption pattern that's coming to keep you, quote, safe, but it's keeping you from doing things you really want to be doing.
Yeah, and for sure, and depending on how much capacity you're creating in your nervous system. So I actually write about the four Fs in my book, and in terms of like what does that look like in a leader, right? So what does fight or flight look like in a leader? There's some very active responses, and then freeze and fawn are a little more passive, right, or a little more docile. And if you really think the nervous system in the three states, right? If you're in a normal ventral state, it's calm, you can handle situations as they're coming up. That sympathetic, that activation, right, is wired into all of us. This is a totally
Mhm,
normal human response. So fight or flight,
mhm.
getting active and being able to run from the predator, that,
Right.
and then moving into freeze or fawn, right? So like when I described that, brain scan that I did where I dropped into that freeze or fawn, that basically means like I was kind of already in an unregulated state, a dysregulated state, in that I
Right.
dropped into freeze and fawn without really having any stimuli. So I'm much more aware now of like how I move through and notice like when my activation gets higher, because
Mhm.
then I know that's the moment in which I'm reaching I'm reaching capacity, right? And I don't want to drop down into a complete shutdown, a complete freeze on state. So,
As you're describing this, I'd like to underline for people who don't know you that you already had experienced by the time of the pandemic a lot of success in the business world. So it's not like you couldn't somehow sort of skirt it or, like somehow you managed to do some successful things.
mhm.
And yet I'm guessing that it took a lot of energy that you maybe didn't need to expend had you understood this thing about yourself, that you had this response going on.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and my achiever type. So yeah, to give your audience a little bit of background, right? I mean,
Mhm.
I have a degree from a very prestigious university in journalism, and I then from there went. I've worked with I think a dozen Fortune 100 CEOs, right? In my first 17 years of work, I was in house, so director level at a large multinational based in Minnesota, and then have been running my own solopreneur business doing transformational change for the last 13 years and moving from one big organization to another and helping leaders in those situations doing things that they didn't think were possible, that were C-suite level, board level, type projects and visibility. Yeah, I was always, always, always pushing.
And when you say that, I'm willing to bet that that was also a way to consciously or unconsciously mask some of these responses, that maybe the reason you finally got your diagnosis in the pandemic is because literally the world shut down and you had no choice but to look at it.
Yeah, and it was also a moment where I was able to see and not maybe handle all the fear around me, right? So if I think about in the pandemic, it was like, yeah, it was also everyone else was amplified at that moment, right? And so um, for me, it became incredibly difficult to kind of manage the overload I was in, along with the overload of my nuclear family, right, who were also all experiencing incredible fear.
When you mention your family,
Yeah,
and I asked you, where does this come from? What's the story? And you're like, there's no story. This is just how I'm wired. Um, what that says to me is that probably in your family there's some patterns. Like something happened, but it didn't happen to you. It happened somewhere, and those patterns get passed along, and we're wired according to what we're born into.
yeah, for sure. I mean, in addition to the some of that, brainier stuff I've done, I've more recently worked with internal family systems, which is a type of therapy where you're looking at parts and what part is active in my brain, what part is in the living room, which really for those not familiar with it is just like what's front and center, what story is front and center, and which part of me in my earlier life and generationally, right? So 100% agree there's generational trauma that each of us kind of like gets wired into our DNA, and also just into those
Mhm.
patterns that we have in our upbringings. And so for me, that in internal family systems and in my parts work has helped me kind of notice, right? I have a very sensitive creative part that is very, very early from my childhood, right? I was one of those like, oh gosh, what did they my nickname Curious George, right? I was one of those like always off and looking to get into mischief and making things and by myself, and very entrepreneur. It's the reason I'm an entrepreneur, right? I'm always off. Look, like, what can I make? And yes, and some of my friends from childhood would tell you that I also tested things on them that I probably shouldn't have. But um that like was that's a very sensitive creative part of me, right? And so that artist isn't something that is very welcome in corporate America. It
Right.
is there are things, there are masks that I had to learn, and that I still know, and there are times and places where it's like, yep, you know the um the creative artist type is not welcome in this room. So, and that really actually comes back full circle to the book of like having to embrace being seen and being vulnerable as an artist, right? And so being able to write a business book that's got lots of smart things in it feels very different than me sharing my story that has a component of things that, in a work environment aren't totally, not always embraced. So me talking about my PTSD in the introduction of the book is a very vulnerable moment, and it harkens back to that artist and creator of like that's ultimately what the book was about, of creating.
I love that you bring that up because um, an acquaintance of mine, somebody I work with, somebody that I'm good friends with, she's a chef and she just puts things together like these weird combinations. It's magical, right? And she talked about how she used to get in trouble for some of the things that she loves to do best. And it occurred to me that that's true. Like for a lot of us, the things that we love to do best, once we finally give ourselves permission to own them, do them, allow them, right, are sometimes the things that got us into trouble, got the eye rolls, got the, if you continue to do that, you might not be invited on the play dates, whatever. Like those things that got us into trouble and we learn to kind of tamp them down are actually the source of some of our greatest brilliance when we let ourselves go there.
For sure. And there's also the reality of different environments, right? I mean, and so having gotten laid off, that was how I exited my corporate career. Is I got laid off. It wasn't personal. It was the end of the 2008 recession, and our whole team got laid off. But let me tell you, it wasn't part of my storyline. Did not expect that. And so the universe making it easy for me to find that first consulting gig within 2 weeks, like that was the universe going, uh-huh, yep, you're done with that part. So, we're going to get you into a place where your artist, your creator, your experimenter is more embraced. And obviously, too, it's allowed me to have a little bit more voice, stronger voice than, and sometimes as an employee, I think there's a right and a wrong, and you're kind of expected to toe the line depending on the position and, positional authority and place that you are in the hierarchy. So I definitely enjoy having a little more freedom in my voice as an entrepreneur.
It's interesting what you just said too. I mean, I'm thinking about, I too had a career that ended abruptly and not as originally planned, right? And for me, the business part was a lot scarier. For me, writing the book was actually like, yay, I get to write a book. It kind of feels like you and I went in opposite directions where like, within a little bit you had consulting gigs. Whereas for me, I really had to talk myself into, no, I can be self-employed. I can work for so this actually comes back to something you and I talked about before we started recording, which is that we each have spaces where it's going to be a push for us, but we're not quite so scared of them. And there's things that we're a little bit, to be frank, terrified of doing. So, do you have thoughts about how people can start to, because as a leader, there's a lot of components to it. How, as a leader, you can start to make friends with those parts of yourself that are a little bit scared?
Well, I mean, I'm a big believer in small steps. So, it's
Mhm.
literally and the experimenter of, in my DNA is try something, right? Try something
Mhm.
small. And what I have struggled with, or what's been
Mhm.
hard with the book and really over the last year, and probably just in my attitude in general, is I'm not a big social media person. I don't have a big following, right? I have a
Uh-huh.
tiny little newsletter list. They're all my super fans and
Mhm.
humans who have been, past clients, etc. But it's under 100 people, and
Mhm.
literally, like having to launch a book and draw attention to myself and be performative was something that I really rebelled against. I did not want to have to do that part of the author journey. And the word I just used, right, is maybe the shift that I've had over the year. It's been a year since I released the book, or just about a year. And it's that performative sense that I have learned through those small experiments of doing posts, of doing social media posts, of coming on podcasts, of going in communities and talking. And what I've realized with every single one of them is like, as long as I'm not thinking of it as a performative mask and like I'm, doing some kind of phony baloney-ness, right? That's the moment in which the act for me is incongruent with who I am. Right. So it's not so much that I dislike social media. I dislike when I drop into performative mode.
The artifice of
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. Or like that I feel, or that when I worked with a LinkedIn coach in particular, and it was like, I was resisting, I was change resisting, right? And I could coach myself through that because I see it and do it in others, right? But it was the reality of like, I just dislike there's a formula and you got to do it like this for the algorithm to want it and like it and for other people to understand. And I just like listened to the advice from the coach and just went, yeah, you know what? That might be the thing that works. What part of this doesn't feel right for me, right? What part of it is not in alignment for me? And so I think when you come into any situation with greater, with self-awareness, right, then it's like you can get to those answers faster and you can do those smaller experiments. And so now it's like, yep, I know when I've got to post, when I no longer schedule anything for social media. When I have something to say, I sit down and I write it and I share it.
Yeah.
And it's easy.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
not, so, but it took me, it's been 4 or 5 months to get there, right? Of like, come into that alignment of what those experiments look like in being able to get to a place where it's like, how do I actually do this? How am I in a different place? And by the way, I've grown my account by 50%. So
Woo! And I want to highlight this because I think this is really important. And I remember when I too was like, you're going to have to get an author platform. And I'm like, just writing the book is going to be plenty,
yeah.
thanks. Right. But there's the difference between performative.
Mhm.
I mean, like it's all standing up and being seen, but performative as in trying to be what you are supposed to be and fit yourself to some kind of a mold versus I'm going to share the best part of myself and I'm going to learn to be confident standing in that authority. Those are two very different things and it feels differently and people feel it. And, I do want to point out that Kris, I've known you for a while, but I didn't get an invite to your book launch. And I totally would have gone. But you know what I'm saying? Like, and I've done that too. It's like, okay, do I want to invite these people? And the truth is the people who know you, they want to come. They want to support you. I saw our mutual friend post and I was like, oh, look at that. Kris launched her book. Congratulations. But I totally would
Uh,
have gone.
and
And
that,
and at the same time, I don't go to everything. So you don't know what somebody wants or doesn't
yeah.
want. You have to put yourself out there and it isn't your business if they want to pick up what you're laying down. That's their
Right.
job.
And so that book launch party, right, from a year ago,
Uh-huh.
like what I could
Yeah.
handle was all my
Yeah.
closest humans. And by that I mean I think there were like 50 people. Like half of that family. Like
Yeah.
my son was in, from college, flew
Yeah.
in from college for another event, but it was like, okay, like that's who I wanted there. Would I do the party the same way? Probably yeah, like because I've grown and expanded. I now know like okay, that's how it's gonna go, and I can handle that. But I was very uncomfortable, in that moment.
Well, can I just
Mhm.
interrupt and say that my second book launch, I didn't invite any of my family of origin. So because I write memoir, right? And so I'm just saying, like, it's there's no one right
For
way
sure.
to write and put a book out there. There's just figuring more and more, who are you and how do you want to express yourself in the world? And so I love that you did that. And think of all the people who can read this book. I mean, listen to the title even, Inspired by Fear, Becoming a Courageous Change Leader. I want to read that. And if you hadn't written it, how could I read it? Right?
Yeah, I mean, and there's definitely a lot of person. My dad, also, as speaking of family of origin, right? Of like, who are the people when you
Mhm.
wrte a book? You're like,
Uh-huh.
oh, I'm visually, I'm chewing on my fingernails, right? And, you know, um, The some of that I did some safe testing, right, with during my beta readers, right, of having some people who I was a little uncomfortable with, like, read it, and that made me more confident that I was not going to step on toes anywhere, and not so much that it was performative, but just that it gave me a sense of like more certainty. I reduced the uncertainty.
Right, you're checking what's out there, and then if people have resistance to it, am I okay with it or do they have a point? It's not changing your book to make everyone happy. I think that's such a great point you just made.
Yeah, the stuff that the feedback was, it was stuff I was like, "Yep, thank you for the feedback."
Uh-huh.
I didn't do everything, I didn't
Uh-huh.
you don't have to change everything from everybody. I know that
Right.
from, 20, 30 years of working with, executives and their feedback of like, how do you actually make
Mhm.
sure that the right words are still on the page, so to
Mhm.
speak. But for
Absolutely.
me, it was, I think I still think one of the things that makes me proudest is, my dad, who's in his 80s, right, still says, "That's the best book I read last year." And
Oh.
not in a like, pat me on the head, but like I was like, wow, I explained change leadership and the psychology and the emotional, things that I have learned over, 25 plus years of working with leaders in large organizations, and the stuff that comes with the mumbo jumbo of like what I do. I was like, wow, my dad gets it.
Mhm.
I did a good job.
And when you put it that way too, like, I look at someone who's done the work you've done. I mean, I taught high school, and I think that's a special own kind of thing, but I look at somebody who's done the kind of thing, and I'm like, "Ooh, could I ever," like, wow, she's such a big deal. She's done this important stuff. And yet, at the end of the day, and I think we all have read books like that where we read it and like, "Oh, I could never be as amazing as this book, this person, this author, this life, whatever."
Yeah.
I love that you are pulling back the curtains on, yeah, I've done amazing things. And also, my poor little nervous system needs some attention just like every other human being. And we are all here capable of doing this amazing work. And so, therefore, who am I not to write a book? And hearing you say that, I offer this up to the people all the time that I meet who are like, well, that's amazing, but I could never write a book because I'm not Kris, or whatever, right? And you're saying like you were afraid your dad might not like it either, and he loved it.
Yeah, and I know you've experienced us having, published, not just written a book, but also publishing the
Mhm,
book, right?
mhm,
Because I wrote two books before I published this one. Right.
mhm.
And so that part of my story is, like those books, the time is not right for those books. They're, first of all, the first one, a historical fiction book set in medieval France, is probably a little ambitious for my first attempt at writing a book.
Ah,
And the
yeah.
second one is not, the timing isn't right with related to some family things, right? It's more of a memoir, personal story. And so those books that I wrote, right? And
Uh-huh.
publishing a book is very different than just writing a book, and how you publish. I
Mhm,
feel that's one of the things that I really learned as I actually took that step of like the
mhm,
understanding the publishing process
mhm,
of like what kind of publishing process was going to support me, right?
mhm.
And so that coming back to those like uncomfortable, unsafe, moments of like, where do I decide and discern what works for me? And I really had to decide that self-publishing was the route for me.
Oh, absolutely. You know what? God bless all the people who do that fancy stuff and are extra successful, but I've self-published and my books are out there, and that frees me to do more work of my own.
Yeah, but it's a
Mhm.
very different, it's
Totally
a very
different.
different, you have it very different as yeah, very different experience. And I really, part of that was choosing to the people that I worked with, right? So
Right,
choosing the developmental editor, choosing the
right.
copy editor and line editor and the book designer, right? Those people, to me, they were other artists, right?
Uh-huh.
I talked to a lot of people,
Mhm.
and it was like, these are the artists that I want to collaborate with.
Right.
And that felt very different to me.
Get yourself a good team and do not go on the cheap for that.
Yeah,
That doesn't mean break your budget, but it means find people that you really are gonna be proud of the work that they're doing on your behalf.
and exactly, and that we were collaborating. It just took it
Absolutely.
completely changed the energy. And
A
the
100%.
creative, the creative flow that happened between us. And I think all of them would say, yeah, they probably learned from me too, right? In terms of
Right.
doing the way I approach the book development process. So
That's how you get the book across the finish line. I was looking up the name because I was like, who is that guy? Do you remember, have you ever read anything by Ken Follett?
yeah,
So he used to write this sort of like pulp, sort of, like, you know, sort of genre stuff, right? And he was known for that. And all of a sudden, he wrote these books that are just really, really well known, epic, wide sweeping trilogy things that are just, they're really, really well known and they're really, really good and they're very successful. And so when you mentioned that, I just want to say for everybody who's like, oh, but I'm not Ken Follett, for
mhm.
example, again, yeah, I have no doubt that you're going to write those books that you mentioned because they're in you. They want to be written. You will write them. You wouldn't have told me about them today if they weren't in you. And yet, the first thing you write might not be that sweeping French historical epic, right?
Yeah,
The first thing you write, and you didn't even come to this one as your first writing because as you said, you were writing in your job for that whole time. So I think it's really good for people to remember when they're comparing their little story with yours. Like, oh, well, she wrote a book. Yeah. And there's more books to come and there's writing behind it. And it's a life path. It's not this one isolated thing that you suddenly just like gave birth to something that was brilliant. It's not like that. It's like you said, it's showing up for those small little things.
yeah. I mean, writing is definitely a practice. I mean, I know you know that. I mean, I would have defined myself as a writer, right, from early childhood, and
Mhm.
that's where the introvert, went to, right? Where when I wanted to escape was go find a book, go read a book in my room, right? And then also, later writing in my own thing. And I've been journaling and writing my morning pages for I don't know at least 15 years. So
We will link to your book where people can buy it in the show notes if people are looking for that. But if you just wanted to, in this last little time that we have, like if there was one thing that you want people to know about your book that your book would unpack for them further, what's the one thing you really want to make sure gets said in this interview that people know about your book that they need to know for themselves?
yeah, I would come back to courage. And I think, there's my opening quote, right, is from FDR, and that courage is not the absence of fear, but deciding that something is more important. And so for me, those decisions on my nervous system, right, of like, can I expand? Can I go into an uncomfortable space? Always come back to, is there something that more important than the fear that I'm feeling, right? And what is it? And so for me in my work, and that becomes easy, or me in my life, right, of like, yeah, there's times when I'm like, I got to send the kid off, right, and I'm nervous about that. And nervous and apprehension, uncertainty, all forms of fear, right? And noticing, can I do this, right? Is there something more important? What's more important? Yep, well, the baby bird's got to fly. So when I find, those reasons, those moments of courage, the fear is more manageable for me. So that's how I work my way through it and reframe fear.
Thank you so much for being here, Kris.
Thanks for having me, Amy.
Thanks for listening to Courageous Wordsmith. Today's episode featured Kris Jennings. You can read more about her and check out her links in the show notes. That's where you'll find my links too. Backstage at Courageous Wordsmith, our production team is the brilliant Brooke Roy and me, Amy Hallberg. You can subscribe to this podcast right on this page. Sign up for my emails and share with friends who want to write. And how about you? You have stories to tell. What if you let yourself tell them? What would that look like for you? I am Amy Hallberg, and until we meet again, travel safely.